Great. So we are live now. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwan. This is Ishan Sharma. And today, this evening, with me, I have Dr. Jyoti Gulati Balachandran joining us from Penn State University. Dr. Balachandran is a historian of medieval and early modern South Asia. Uh, and the Indian Ocean world. Her research focuses on the social and cultural histories of Muslim communities in Gujarat and Western Indian Ocean. Her first book reconstructs the literary, social, and historical world of Sufi preceptors, disciples, and descendants who shaped the textual articulations of the Muslim past and of the region of Gujarat from the 15th to the 17th century. Today, she is going to talk about power and piety in the 15th century Gujarat. So, without further ado, it is an honor and a privilege to host Dr. Balachandran this evening on Karwan. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Ishan, for that kind introduction and for inviting me here to share my work. I also want to thank everybody who's behind the Karwan initiative for putting together such amazing talks. I should also mention that as a former student at Delhi University, I spent almost a decade as a student in Delhi University. It is very exciting for me to come to a forum that is led by the students at Delhi University. So thanks once again for inviting me. And I look forward to sharing some of my work. I'm going to start my PowerPoint so that I can actually also show you some images as I go along. So my talk today is based on my recent work, Narrative Past, the Making of a Muslim Community in Gujarat from about 1400 to 1650 of the Common Era. And as Ishan pointed out in this book, I look at the textual production by Sufi disciples and descendants between the 15th and the 17th centuries. And then argue that these texts are very important in shaping the narratives of Muslim pasts along a specific regional orientation. Now, while my book covers kind of a long time period, today in my talk, I'm going to focus largely on the 15th century itself. I want to demonstrate the ways in which power and piety intersected in 15th century Gujarat. And here I'm alluding to the establishment of an independent sultanate in Gujarat and the foundation of several Sufi khanqahs or residences in and around Ahmedabad, a city that serves as the capital of the Gujarat Sultans for several decades. So some of the questions I want us to keep in mind as I present today are related to how we understand these twin processes of the establishment of a new political dispensation in Gujarat and the expanding Sufistic community in this region. Were these processes mutually exclusive, or did they intersect? And how did contemporary historical narratives shape our understanding of these processes? So here's the plan for my talk. I hope to speak for about 40-45 minutes. I actually want to begin not with the 15th century, but with pre-15th century Gujarat and give you a very, very quick overview of what we know about the Muslim communities in different parts of Gujarat prior to the 15th century. And I think it is really important to consider that because without considering this pre-15th century history, we cannot fully appreciate the nature of shifts that we see in the 15th century. So I'll begin with that. And then I'll delve into the 15th century properly. And here I want to talk about what I call the conjoined processes of state and community formation in 15th century Gujarat. And here I'll introduce you to some key figures from the 15th century, including the first Sultan of Gujarat, Muzaffar Shah, and his invitation to a relatively lesser known Sufi by the name Ahmad Khattu to establish his Khanqa in Gujarat. And then also going further into the 15th century, look at another Sultan, Sultan Mahmud Begra, who considerably expanded the tomb shrine complex of Sheikh Ahmad Khattu. And finally, I'll have some concluding remarks for us, where I'll briefly highlight the importance of the intersection of power and piety in 15th century Gujarat in the conception of a regional state and community. But so let's begin with pre-15th century Gujarat and sort of look at some of the key aspects of what we know about the formation of Muslim communities in this part of the world. And here I have two maps, as you can see, one that zooms out a little bit so that we can see how Gujarat is located in the context of the larger maritime Indian Ocean world. And on the right, we can zoom in a little bit to see more closely what are some of the important port cities, some of the other cities in the interior, and also their relation to other prominent trading cities in north and northwestern of the Indian subcontinent. So many of you probably already know that the maritime Indian Ocean context was actually quite central to the establishment of early Muslim communities in Gujarat, actually all along the western seaboard of the Indian subcontinent, including Gujarat. And here I have highlighted one of the most prominent port cities, Kambayat, also known as Cambay. And the commercial links across this maritime Indian Ocean led to the formation of trading communities in various port cities in Gujarat, including along with Kambayat or Cambay, Paroj, Ranbir, Somnath, Veraval, Bhadreshwar, and there have been some archaeological work that shows that these communities also existed further interior into Gujarat in places like Patan as early as the 12th and quite possibly the 11th century. And of course, the formation of these Muslim communities further inland was facilitated by Gujarat's connection to these various other trading cities in the north and the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent. Of course, these were not just trading communities. It's not only Muslim merchants of diverse backgrounds that come and settle in the region. The formation of these communities is also a way for a variety of learned Muslim men to come and become part of these Muslim communities. So they play important roles like leading daily prayers, transmitting religious knowledge, and also sometimes serving as communally organized arbiters of disputes arising within local groups. Another kind of aspect of, as we look at the history of Muslim communities in pre-15th century Gujarat, is to consider the presence of the Shia Ismaili community in places like Patan and possibly Bhadreshwar as well. From the late 13th century, we also know that another way in which these various communities expanded in Gujarat was through the incursions of the Delhi sultans in this region. Towards the end of the 13th century, for example, the Delhi Sultan Alauddin Khilji subjugated the local Waghela chieftains and made Patan the provincial capital of the Delhi Sultanate. And the creation of this stronghold in Gujarat encouraged Muslim settlement and the building of new structures of religious learning and administration to accommodate the needs of an expanding Muslim community. Right? So this is again, it's a very schematic overview of some of the things that we know about the establishment of Muslim communities in pre-15th century Gujarat. Now, the question that I want to add to this is like, how exactly do we know about these communities? What are the sources of our information about these Muslim communities? And our understanding of the extent and the nature of these communities is actually predominantly shaped by inscriptional and architectural material. So I'll give you just an example again from this important city of Kambayat, a very, very important port city. And here you can see parts of the Friday Mosque that is dated to around 1325. This mosque is supposed to have been built by a wealthy merchant from Iran, Umar ibn Ahmad al-Khazaruni, who actually also had his tomb right next to the mosque as well. Right? So one of the ways in which we know about the presence of Muslim communities is by actually looking at the remains of these various structures that have survived. In the case of Kambayat, thanks to the work of Elizabeth Lambourne, we also know that Kambayat is also an important site for stone carvings, right? Stone carvings that were used in grave memorials produced by Muslim patrons, not just in Cambay, but also in places like East Africa and Java. And so there's significant material evidence, if you like, that would indicate the extent and nature of these Muslim communities in pre-15th century Gujarat. Another important way of knowing about them is, of course, inscriptions, right? Of course, and these inscriptions can be found on mosques, inscriptions can be found on tombstones as well. In fact, epitaphs, these inscriptions that mark the tombstones of individuals buried, is an important way in which we know about the diversity of people who were involved in these communities. So here I have one example of what an epitaph might look like. Which talks about how this is the grave of the weak individual, Azeb, and foreigner Al-Gharib, Kamaluddin Suleiman, son of Ahmad, son of Hussein, son of Abu Sharif al-Bambi. Right? And then it states the exact date and the year that this person died. And this epitaph from Kambayat or Kambe is in many ways representative of the fragmented nature of information available to us on the individuals who inhabited the various Muslim settlements in the region. And so, I mean, there's a lot that we can tell from this inscription, right? So we can tell that this person Al-Bami came from Bam, which is in the Kirman province of Iran. There are a bunch of genealogical details here about his father, his grandfathers. So there's some degree of genealogical depth. And scholars have actually also cross-checked this epitaph with a couple of other epigraphs from Kambayat to ascertain that there are actually at least two other family members of this person who were present in Kambayat. And Ziauddin decided wonderful work with many of these inscriptions to kind of put together some kind of a sense for the links that existed between various individuals who were living in Gujarat in this time period. So the piecemeal information on individuals, right, their occupation, their ancestral ties, found in hundreds of similar inscriptions, is incredibly crucial for us to understand and at times make calculated speculations on the economic, socio-political, and cultural dynamism of Muslim presence in Gujarat. At the same time, however, the diverse yet fragmentary inscriptional record is reflective of the fragmented ecologies within which Muslim communities thrived in Gujarat prior to the 15th centuries. Right? The inscriptions reveal names, occupations, and other information, but these inscriptions were not the narrative tools through which the long-term presence of Muslims was given any meaning. Right? Indeed, it is very rare to come across any genealogical depth in the epigraphical record. Inscriptions could not sustain the historical sentiments of community consciousness. Right? Unlike texts, they were not copied or cross-referenced to generate a reserve of collective historical memory. And of course, Gujarat, finds mention in the narrative traditions of the Delhi Sultanate. So all these imperial histories that are written at the court of the Delhi Sultans mention Gujarat, talk about Gujarat, but Gujarat is really subsumed within this larger framework, imperial framework at the Delhi Sultans. They do not, really tap. There is not much local information that is available about many of these sites in Gujarat in those narratives that are produced at the court of the Delhi Sultans. So it remains ironic, right, that while we have Muslim communities in Gujarat for a long time prior to the 15th century, we have very little detail and depth to the processes of community formation before the 15th century. Now, getting into my second part, that's really at the heart of this presentation. Things change in the 15th century. There are certain key developments at the turn of the 15th century that shift the historical record of Muslim presence in Gujarat from inscriptions to a variety of texts, most prominently the Tawarikh, or state histories or court chronicles that are written at the court of Gujarat Sultans, but also compilations of Sufi teachings and lives in a variety of genres, like the Malfuzat, which are collections of public assemblies of Sufis, or Tazkirat, the life histories or biographies, if you like, of Sufis within the context of emerging Sufi residences in eastern Gujarat. And this shift in the historical record lay at the intersection of a new state formation in Gujarat in the form of the Gujarat Sultanate and the arrival of certain Sufis, in particular Sheikh Ahmad Khatu, who I'll be looking at in greater detail in a moment, at the turn of the 15th century. Right? So then this new Sultanate was capable of supporting and sustaining spiritual fraternities and their organization in a way in which it had not been possible prior to the 15th century. And Sufi teachers, Sufi masters on their part, were able to envision a collaborative role in the making of a Muslim community in Gujarat. So it was this fortuitous conjuncture that produced the beginnings of sustained reflections on the Muslim past in Gujarat, giving the region some semblance of a composite historical reality. So as I move into this period of the 15th century and introduce certain key figures from this time period, I want to actually preface by mentioning three important things. One is that, oftentimes when we think of Gujarat Sultanate, right, we often think about how it's situated, within this larger trajectory in which the Delhi Sultanate disintegrates, giving rise to a variety of independent sultanates. So we know that as the former governors of the Delhi Sultan severed their ties with Delhi, roughly from around the middle of the 14th century, you have Bengal, Jaunpur, Gujarat, and the Deccan that rise as independent sultanates. The thing that I want to mention here is that if we only look at a region like Gujarat through the political career of the Delhi Sultan, it really obliterates certain key processes, a degree of continuity that we see in certain historical processes. Right? For example, these processes included the proliferation of settlements by Muslims that often preceded, not just followed, the penetration of the military campaigns of the Delhi Sultans. And some of these settlements were a result of direct military intervention by the Delhi Sultans, but many also grew independently of any state involvement and predated the military conquest by the Sultans. So as Simon Digby famously argued, and I quote, state formation of the provincial sultanates was built on the local strength of the settler communities that had grown up in the previous century, unquote. So as we think about Gujarat, we want to be aware that there are certain processes that are already in place in this region. Second point that I want to make before we get into the 15th century is that Sufis and Sufi khanqahs, Sufi residences, were important organizational nodes for several of these settlements over the course of the late 13th and 14th centuries. In the famous case of the Chishti Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya, we know that he had Khalifas or spiritual successors who carried his message to other parts of North India and Deccan and formed their own independent constituencies, right, in these proliferating Muslim settlements in the 14th century. And the third aspect that I want us to keep in mind is that this expansion of Sufi residences is accompanied by the production of texts and certain narrative strategies that established the authority of the Sufi, as well as its centrality in the thriving of various Muslim settlements. Right? And I already alluded to texts like the Malfuzat or the Tazkirat that are produced. Now, I mentioned these 3 points here in particular to remind us that given Gujarat's ongoing connections with North India and the Deccan, the Sufis who established their residences in Gujarat were very familiar with these Sufi texts, and their disciples were very familiar with them as well. And the disciples are the ones who go on to inscribe the lives of these Sufis in texts produced in Gujarat. And I think it's also important to, we often look at the, Western Indian Ocean world as some kind of an important kind of orientation for Gujarat. And of course, it's very, very important. It actually brought several learned Muslim men into Gujarat. But I think it's also important to note that Gujarat in this time period, as its history is moving into the 15th century, is also very much aligned with certain historical and narrative processes that have shaped the experience of Muslim communities in various parts of North India and the Deccan. All right, so let's move into the 15th century, kind of with this idea that there are that the region is very fertile for a robust state and community to take hold because of all of these processes that it had been interconnected with until throughout the 13th and the 14th centuries. So what we see in Gujarat in the 15th century here is the merging of two long-term trends. Right? So, so on the one hand, you have the gradual inroads that the Delhi sultans and the governors had been making in the region since the late 13th century, and it led to the formation of a new state, especially as the armies of Timur sacked Delhi. It encouraged several of Delhi Sultan's governors, including Zafar Khan, who was representing Delhi Sultans around that time in Gujarat, to kind of carve out their own independent political authority. And so we have, at the beginning of the 15th century, Zafar Khan, who works within the patchwork of negotiations and alliances that had marked the relationship between the representatives of the Delhi sultans and local chieftains to assert his own independent authority. And he, of course, makes Patan as his new capital. Now, at the same time, the dense network of navigable routes that had facilitated the movement of learned Muslim men to and through Gujarat for several centuries brought a new set of Sufis to the region at the turn of the 15th century. Now, some of this movement, again, just in the case of the political developments that we see, in the case of Sufi movement, again, we see that the sacking of Delhi by Timurid armies played an important role in the movement of several important important Sufis who kind of were forced to leave Delhi and find patronage elsewhere. And Zafar Khan's control of this area around Patan and also the central plains of eastern Gujarat actually turned out to be extremely crucial, because this was not only a place which had a significant agricultural hinterland that could be harnessed for revenue. It was also very much part of the dense network of trade routes that facilitated the movements of goods and people. So with the consolidation of his authority, he was easily able to intercept the movement of several Sufis who were passing through Gujarat and then invite them to establish their residences in his new political territory to buttress his growing political power. And clearly, having served the Delhi Sultan, Zafar Khan was very familiar with the importance of Sufis' blessings in sanctifying his claims to temporal authority. So it was, it was not the kind of investment that the Delhi Sultans had been able to make in Gujarat, given their limited political and economic interests in this region. So one of the earliest, articulations of this emerging collaboration that we see in 15th century Gujarat happens through the arrival of this, as I said, a lesser known Sufi, Sheikh Ahmad Khatu. And much of what I'm going to say now in this section, as we talk about the intersection of power and piety, is based on at least two prominent texts that Ahmad Khatu's disciples composed in Gujarat around the middle of the 15th century, a few years after the death of Sheikh Ahmad Khatu. So here it's significant to know that while for the pre-15th century, we do not have these kinds of narrative details to know much about who the religious leaders were, who the Sufis were, who had settled in Gujarat, now we suddenly see this shift in texts that give us significant narrative details on several Sufis in Gujarat in the 15th century. So thanks to the inscription of Ahmad Khatu's life and teachings in these texts, we know that Sheikh Ahmad Khatu was born in Delhi. He was supposedly a son of a military commander in Delhi. And the story goes that there was a dust storm where this very young Ahmad was lost, and he was taken along in a caravan that ran between Delhi and northern Gujarat and brought to Nagaur, where actually brought to a village named Khatu, and that's how he gets his name Khatu. There's a village Khatu near Nagaur where there is a local spiritual mentor and teacher by the name Baba Ishaq, who takes him under his spiritual tutelage, and Ahmad Khatu ends up gaining much of his education through this association with Baba Ishaq. Baba Ishaq supposedly dies around 1379. Ahmad Khatu is very distressed by that, and he starts a lot of travel. He leaves Khatu even though the local community there pleads with him, says, no, you are, the latest in the line of spiritual mentors to protect our local community in Khattu. But Ahmad Khattu was not going to stay. He wanted to travel. We find him back in Delhi at some point. He's actually supposed to be in Delhi around the time Amir Temur's armies are sacking Delhi, and he accompanies them all the way to Central Asia, and from there he performs the Hajj to Mecca and comes back at some point around the turn of the 15th century and ends up in Gujarat. Now he has no intention of staying in Gujarat. And there's very, very interesting kind of details, very minute details of how he gets a carriage. He's on his way to cross the river, on his way to around there, except that I guess Zafar Khan had plans, right? So when Zafar Khan comes to know of Ahmad Khattu's presence in his region, he immediately goes up to him and kind of convinces him to actually find a nice spot and settle down and establish his residence there. So here, especially in the story of Zafar Khan's meeting with Ahmad Khattu, we get a glimpse of the early intersections of political and spiritual authority that would shape the historical narratives on the formation of Muslim community in Gujarat. So, one of the things that Ahmad Khattu recollects in his Malfuzat compiled by his disciples is that as he made his way from Patan to Kambayat to further south of Randeer, Zafar Khan stopped him, as I just mentioned, and Ahmad Khattu asked Zafar Khan. He says, you had such a large number of soldiers and elephants. Why did you not go to Delhi to help Delhi, to help the residents of Delhi? And Zafar Khan gives a long-winded explanation, which basically boils down to the fact that if he had helped Delhi, then the entire Gujarat would have slipped out of his hands. It's so, and then soon after, Zafar Khan is, he hopes to receive Ahmad Khattu's blessings and provides him revenue from the village of Utliya in Tolka, and so equipped with these assurances of political security and a monthly allowance, then Ahmad Khattu makes his way back north of Kambayat and reaches Sarkhej, which is the site that I have marked here on the map. And Ahmedabad is the capital city that was built in the vicinity of Sarkhej in 1411. So let me, as we're talking about this kind of intersection, right, between political and spiritual authority, it's very evident in the way Ahmad Khattu's life is narrated in this text around the middle of the 15th century. I want to put this in some perspective by actually talking about another Sufi who was in Gujarat around the same time as Sheikh Ahmad Khattu. And this, unlike Ahmad Khattu, is not some lesser known figure. I'm talking about the disciple of the Chishti Nasiruddin Chirag Delhi, Muhammad Kesudaraz. Muhammad Kesudaraz, who some of you may know, ultimately goes to the Bahmanid Sultanate and establishes his residence in Gulbarga. Right? So in one of the earliest biographies of Muhammad Kesudaraz, Siyar-e Muhammadi, his disciple recounted, because Kesudaraz is also in Delhi and he's kind of fleeing the sack of Delhi to make his way back into Deccan. So his disciple recounts Kesudaraz's journey from Delhi to Gulbarga to the Deccan, and he talks about the wide network of disciples who provided monetary and other resources to aid the journey from Delhi to Deccan. And you really see the contrast because Ahmad Khattu does not have any claims to a wide network of disciples who are there to receive him at every point that he stops in his journey. Now, when Muhammad Kesudaraz reaches Baroda, Zafar Khan is supposed to have made an offer. He made an offer, I'm sorry, not Zafar Khan. Actually, Zafar Khan makes an offer to sponsor his journey. So he's happy to provide for the journey. But then Kesudaraz, after arriving in Kambayat, attracts a big following, and Zafar Khan goes there to pay his respects, and he's just short of asking Kesudaraz to kind of settle in Gujarat, right? And Gesudaraz kind of senses Zafar Khan's discomfort and says that, hey, I'm very willing to settle here in Gujarat and provide my kind of spiritual blessing to your emerging political authority. But Zafar Khan actually rejects this offer. Right? And so Muhammad Gesudaraz is compelled to then leave Gujarat and find patronage elsewhere. As we know, he ends up in Gulbarga. This episode of the meeting between Zafar Khan and Muhammad Gesudaraz is not only told in the text that is written by the disciple of Muhammad Gesudaraz. In Ahmad Khattu's recollections as well, we find kind of references to Muhammad Gesudaraz's presence in Gujarat at the same time that Ahmad Khattu is there. In fact, Ahmad Khattu, he recollects in one of his malfuzat that when he was in Kambayat, one of his old acquaintances, Qazi Nizamuddin, gathered his sons and some other individuals and brought a horse for Ahmad Khattu so that the Sufi could go for the Friday prayers with a whole entourage. And this Qazi is supposed to, he explained that he had seen Muhammad Gesudaraz go to the Friday prayers with their entourage and much pomp. And he said it would be unacceptable to him to see Ahmad Khattu walk alone to the mosque. So Ahmad Khattu clearly, was unsure of how he would survive the journey, and is relieved that he would be looked after. And as we just noted, Zafar Khan actually ends up asking him to stay in Gujarat and establish his residence in Gujarat. So the larger point that I'm trying to make here, right, by highlighting the difference in the outcome of these two Sufis who arrive in Gujarat, is that the textual recounting of both Ahmad Khattu and Muhammad Gesudaraz's journeys and settlements expressed how the interface between political and spiritual authority was not only common, but was actively desired by both sultans and Sufis. Right? The interconnectedness between sultans, Sufi settlements, and textual production that had developed in several places in North India and the Deccan were now evident in Gujarat. And this convergence of state, settlement, and text, as I mentioned at the beginning, shifted the historical narrative of Muslim presence in Gujarat in a dramatic way. Right? So thanks to the textualization of Ahmad Khattu's lives and teachings, it would be impossible to separate the memory of the Sufi from the flourishing of the Gujarat Sultanate. So his disciples, Sheikh Ahmad Khattu's disciples, by writing these texts, marked the first step in envisioning Ahmad Khattu as the pivot around which the Muslim community, led by the Gujarat Sultans, flourished in the 15th century. And as we kind of progress into the 15th century, there are multiple examples that show this kind of conjoined process of state and community formation. There is this famous example from the reign of Sultan Ahmad Shah, who's the founder of the city of Ahmedabad. And the foundation of the city of Ahmedabad is supposed to have been laid by four Ahmads. One is Ahmad Shah, the Sultan of Gujarat. One is Ahmad Khattu. And there are other two Ahmads, about which we actually do not know much, because clearly there were no textual traditions around who the other two Ahmads were. All we know is that they were pious, learned individuals. And so again, you can see how even kind of the foundation of new cities was seen as an important point where you could imagine the convergence of sultanic and Sufi authority. And again, I want to highlight this, as I hope I made it clear when I was talking about Muhammad Gesudaraz, that Ahmad Khattu is a relatively lesser known figure compared to all the Chishti sheikhs that we know of in for example, in North India and the Deccan. He belonged to a Maghribi silsila. Again, we do not know much about the Maghribi silsila in the context of South Asia, as we know a lot more about other Sufi lineages in South Asia. So it is worth noting that that through this kind of political patronage and production of text, a relatively unknown figure is actually made into what many consider to be the patron Sufi of the Gujarat Sultanate, or the royal Sufi of the Gujarat Sultanate. There is, so as we kind of, consider this kind of, roughly the first half of the 15th century, I hope you get a sense for what's going on in the 15th century and how the political and spiritual authority are intersecting. I want to actually shift a little bit to kind of an amazing accomplishment by the Gujarat Sultan Mahmud Begra that takes shapes towards in the second half of the 15th century. So, Sheikh Ahmad Khatu dies sometime in 1445. And soon after his death, the Gujarat Sultans invest in his tomb shrine. So the extensive multi-dome tomb complex at Sarkhej is, it undergoes continuous construction and additions throughout the rest of the 15th century. So beginning with Sultan Mahmud II, the subsequent three sultans Qutbuddin Ahmad, Sultan Mahmud Begra, and Muzaffar Shah II, they added several structures to the mausoleum. And by the early 16th century, the shrine complex dominated the suburban neighborhood of Sarkhej, surpassing in its size and design any other funerary monument in the region. And a few miles away from the city of Ahmedabad, the physical setting of the complex bordering a large polygonal lake named Ahmedsar further distinguished its location. I have multiple pictures to show you all to give you a sense for how splendid this complex is. But Mahmud Begra, as I said, is one of the key sultans who really envisions a much larger role for this shrine complex, much larger than it being just the tomb of an important Sufi. And as a reminder, Mahmud Begra is one of the sultans who is considered to have ushered in one of the most expansionist phase in the history of the Gujarat Sultanate. And of course, another kind of fairly well-known aspect of Mahmud Begra, and this is something that Professor Aparna Kapadia has written about, is how there is also Sanskrit panegyric, Raja Vinoda Mahakavya, where the poet Uday Raja presents the Gujarat Sultan Mahmud Begra not just as an ideal Kshatriya who ruled as a regional king, but also as the lord of Gurjara Mandala, as a Chakravartin or universal king whose moral and military authority extended over the entire subcontinent. So there are different ways in which, whichever way you look, Mahmud Begra really comes across as a very, very important ruler in the history of the Gujarat Sultanate. What I want to focus here is how he, as I said, completely, through a lot of investment shaped the character of the tomb shrine of Sheikh Ahmad Khatu. So let me just pause and show you a few pictures, and then I'll talk about how one can interpret that. So here is the shrine, right? When you enter the shrine complex, this is where you're led inside the tomb shrine of Ahmad Khatu. So this is, of course, the picture on the right side was taken by somebody, who could actually go inside. As a woman, I was not allowed to actually step inside this tomb area. And here there is a mosque adjoining this the tomb shrine of Sheikh Ahmad Khatu, and I here have some markings on the right, so you can see you enter at the bottom of this slide, and then you make your way into Sheikh Ahmad Khatu's tomb shrine, and then there is the mosque, and then you come out, and then you can visit the tomb of Mahmud Begra, and then the other marking that you see on the left is the tomb of certain royal women within this complex as well. So here are the tombs of not just Mahmud Begra, but also two other Gujarat sultans who were buried in the same shrine complex. And these are the tombs of royal women. And as far as I know, I don't think there is any inscription on these tombs. So it's hard to really know. We have some textual references of who these women were, but I'm not sure if there is any inscription here that we can read. And this is just breathtaking, right? So these are the palatial structures, some of the remains of the palatial structures that are added on to Sheikh Ahmad Khatu's tomb shrine. And these are termed as the Queen's quarters. There are some other angles from which you can see the magnificent architecture in this complex. And here on the left side, you can see the sluice, and this whole area now actually has the so-called lake, which you don't really see in this picture, has actually now been filled with water. And I'll show you a picture in a little bit. But again, this on the right side, you can see the dome of Sheikh Ahmed Khattu's shrine in the background. And here is when I visited this shrine in 2012. This is how it looked like, and now with the efforts of the Archaeological Survey of India and a very important NGO and community workers, they have tried to get the water back in this site. So how do we? Frankly, I was like kind of really blown away the first time that I actually learned about Surkhet and I went to visit this, and I was I was surprised that I hadn't heard about Surkhet. I hadn't heard about Sheikh Ahmed Khattu much, when I started doing my research. But what I want to highlight as we look at this combination of royal structures within the complex of Sheikh Ahmed Khattu is that the Sufi and the sultans are inseparable from the history and identity of the region, right? So the nature of royal investment into the Surkhet complex was a further recognition of the joint enterprise of regional state and community formation that had come to fruition by the end of the 15th century. Now, the regional vision of the complex was dramatically enhanced by the unified architectural scheme, where the structures of the complex transitioned seamlessly from one part to the other and matched the architectural style and vocabulary of other monuments built by the Gujarat sultans, both in Ahmedabad and in Champaner. And so this shrine complex, in my opinion, cohered state and community in Gujarat into a single history, where the regional prestige of the sultans and the Sufi emerged together and in relation to each other. And by the time the Mughal emperors incorporated Gujarat into their imperial realm in the late 16th century, Surkhet had developed into a prominent pilgrimage stop in the larger circuit of Muslim shrines in the subcontinent, such that the Mughal emperors themselves visited and offered prayers there. And in the Jahangirnama, Jahangir actually talks about visiting the Surkhet tomb complex and commenting on how splendid this tomb complex was. And one of the things actually a couple of things that I try and remember to mention is that, at least in my experience, each time I have visited this tomb shrine complex, I always see people who are seeking their blessings from Sheikh Ahmed Khattu by visiting his tomb, then make their way to where the Gujarat sultans are buried, and then they offer their respects there as well. So again, that's really is very striking to me. Again, you cannot but understand that the sultans and the Sufis are, as I said, part of a single story. The other aspect that I wanted to share with you is that, to me, I often, but one of the things that came to my mind when I looked at these structures was Fatehpur Sikri, this short-lived capital of Emperor Akbar. And there you see this tomb of Salim Chishti within the palatial structures within the palatial city that had been established by Emperor Akbar. Here, it's kind of the opposite in a way, right? Here is, Sheikh Ahmed Khattu's former Khanqa residence and his tomb shrine that really dominates this site. And the palatial structures are an addition to that complex, and they were meant to be some kind of a summer retreat for the sultans of Gujarat. And this is taking place a good century before what we see in Fatehpur Sikri. So I feel that I in my opinion, it's very, very significant that we have something like this survive from 15th century Gujarat. All right, so let me move to some concluding remarks so that we have hopefully a few minutes for some discussion. So Gujarat in the medieval period was clearly not peripheral to the processes of textual knowledge formation and the experience of local Muslim administration. These processes in Gujarat were undergirded by several thriving urban nodes of settlement, inhabited and traversed by Muslims of diverse ancestral, occupational, sectarian, and spiritual affiliation. At the turn of the 15th century, the ground was ripe in Gujarat for a state a robust urban Muslim community, and a regional identity to establish themselves fairly quickly. And as these historical processes increasingly converged, learned Muslim men gave them depth and meaning in their texts within an evolving urban context. So we know that some learned Muslims wrote tawarikh, state histories, where they inscribed the expansion of Muslim community. But as I've tried to show here, that the production of texts by Sufi disciples and descendants was equally central in creating a reserve of historical memory that was harnessed by later generations to kind of interpret the important role of Sufi preceptors in both shaping the region of Gujarat and anchoring the Muslim community in Gujarat. And in my book, along with Sheikh Ahmad Khattu, I actually talk about two of his contemporary Sufis as well, who belong to the Sohrawardi Silsila. And it's really the memory of these three men that continues to shape the historical narratives in later generations. Now, along with the Persian courtly histories commissioned by the Gujarat Sultans, the narratives on the Sufis, both Ahmad Khattu and his Sohrawardi contemporaries, represented the beginnings of sustained narrative articulations of a Muslim community's past and marked a decisive shift from the fragmentary record of Muslim presence in Gujarat in the preceding period. In other words, from largely dispersed inscriptional instances of Muslim settlers in coastal and interior parts of Gujarat, the texts in the 15th century expressed an evolving sense of regional community with its center in Ahmedabad, the capital of the Gujarat Sultans. In these textual expressions, the history of the community had been anchored both by the Gujarat Sultans, who extended their political influence to the far reaches of Gujarat, as well as Sufis, who were believed to have sanctified the territory of the sultans. And finally, in the historical and narrative constitution of Gujarat's unique and regional identity, the sultans and the Sufis were no longer beholden to Delhi as the political and sacred center. The greater confidence in the ability of the sultans to sustain their rule triggered the desire to chronicle their victories in the well-established genre of the tawarikh and claim a place among other Muslim rulers. The court histories of the Gujarat Sultanates were no longer written from the perspective of the Delhi Sultans, but from the sites where the Gujarat Sultanate had established new centers of authority. At the same time, as members of the expanding learned community in Gujarat sought out by the Gujarat Sultans, Ahmad Khattu and his other contemporaries that I talk about in my book played an increasingly central role, not only as guiding figures, but as important nodes around which other learned men coalesced and formed multi-generational relationships. And while the sultans integrated the physical territory of Gujarat through military campaigns, administrative and institutional organization, the Sufis and their networks of family, education, and spiritual practice tied multiple generations of learned Muslims to one another and to the region. These material foundations shaped both courtly and non-courtly textual imaginations in which the success of the Muslim community was the result of the conjoined processes of state formation and the expansion of Sufi lineages. And one last thing before I truly conclude, I wanted to highlight how Sarkhej has actually become a very, very important site now, kind of a tourist site now to visit. So if you were to visit Ahmedabad and you were to look for places to visit in and around Ahmedabad, Sarkhej will be very, very prominent. And as I said, when I started my research on 15th century Gujarat, there was hardly any information online, but now Sarkhej has actually emerged as a very, very prominent site, and it's often called as a site where you can get some peace and quiet and kind of run away from the hustle and bustle of the city of Ahmedabad. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any comments or questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was a beautiful session, and those beautiful pictures. And in this talk, you also introduce a methodological reorientation towards Sufi texts. Seeing it as a new vision of history of Gujarat, history of Islam in Gujarat, and also social formation in a way. And you also showed the contributions of various Sufi saints, including Ahmed Khattu and others, in the formation of Gujarat. I had I was making notes and I had this question that the relation that the Sufis shared with the ruling elites of Delhi Sultanate, did they share the same kind of relation in Gujarat also? You answered it partially in your talk, but if you want to comment on this.
Yeah, thanks, Ishan. Thanks for your question. And just to kind of comment on the earlier point that you made, I think that is one of the things that I'm trying to do in my book. Kind of, this equation that the history of the Muslim community equals the rise of quote unquote Muslim
Yeah,
power.
yeah.
Is there are other ways of thinking about the history of Muslim community, and if you look at this wide array of Sufi texts, they clearly present a different kind of imagining of the history of the Muslim community. But to go to your question about the relationship between these Sufi sheikhs and the Delhi sultans, I think if you were to look at the long history from like the early 13th century to, let's say, the middle of the 14th century, you do see certain transitions happening. Like at the beginning, where the authority of the Delhi Sultan is constantly contested, many of the Sufis who established themselves around Delhi are seen as a threat to the authority of the Delhi Sultan. But as you move into the 14th century, you definitely see a trend of greater collaboration, part of which comes from the recognition on the part of the Delhi sultans that the authority of the Sufis cannot just be dismissed, but they usually have huge followings. And so the sultans actually start investing in the tomb shrines of many of these Sufis. So they're able to kind of, even if they had a conflictual relationship, they were able to shape their affiliation with the Sufi after his death and tap into the blessings and the legitimacy that the Sufi provided to the Delhi Sultan. So I think you really have to look at the relationship changes between the early 13th and the middle of the 14th century.
Yeah, but it was important to have a relation with the ruling elite to sustain themselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because there's a lot of like material, the material foundations in many ways were often provided by those who were in power.
Yes.
Yeah.
Other question is on the various texts that you mentioned. How are women represented in this text? What is the contribution of women in the formation of Gujarat?
It's a great question, right? I wish all of us could find more women in many of these texts that are produced in that time period. So, the answer is going to be very impressionistic because this was not the lens that I was really using to read these texts. There are women who are mentioned in many of these texts. If I remember correctly, in the texts that are composed by Sheikh Ahmad Khattu's disciples, there are instances of, for example, women who are very much part of his circle of followers. In fact, there's a very important woman who takes care of Ahmad Khattu at the death of Baba Ishaq. And I believe she's also kind of, given a name, because oftentimes, you don't even find names to these women. Where you find a lot of mention of these women is definitely in later texts, right? When, as I mentioned, there are these Sohrawardi Sufis as well, who are contemporaries of Ahmad Khattu, and their line of spiritual descendants continues. It continues to this day. And in many of the texts that they wrote later on in the 16th and the 17th century, lineage was a very important way. Genealogy was a very important way in organizing their history and the role of their ancestors in Gujarat. And there you often find references to women who married into the family. There are references to women being pious and learned as well. But unfortunately, there's not much depth compared to these elite men that we encounter in our sources. So as I said, my answer is probably not very satisfactory, but that's what I have.
Yeah. If you allow, we can take one or two questions. There are many questions for you in the chat. So what we'll do is we'll compile that in a Word file and send it to you through email, and you can get back to them through email. So I'll take just one question because it's about time. This is by Jyotirmaya Khatri. His question is, did the power and piety articulated by the Sufis and religious elites create a regional identity which went beyond the Islamic identity or that of the Mughal identity?
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. So I think one thing I should probably say is that when I and I kind of discussed this in some detail in my book, when we're thinking about regional identity, right? I mean, what is a region? And what do we mean by a region? And what are the limits of this region? So, one thing that I try to do in my book, in the book, is that the regional identity actually shifts and it changes depending upon who is writing about Gujarat and what time period are we looking at. So when I look at, so Sufi texts, for example, form one set of material that can give me insights into this regional identity, and that could be very, very different from another social group writing about their association with the region of Gujarat. So what I find in the Sufi texts is clearly this idea that Gujarat, however, the way it is imagined or understood in the 15th century is that the Sufis have a long kind of association with Gujarat, right? In fact, in later texts in the 16th and the 17th centuries, the arrival of several of these Sufis is actually also presented in a much larger picture, right? That these Sufis actually moved because they wanted to introduce and expand Islam in this region. With the and the importance of this construction of this regional identity in Sufi texts becomes very clear when you actually see how they relate to Mughal identity, right? So we know that for the Mughals, Gujarat is a province, but Gujarat through these textual productions actually continues to assert a very specific, unique, composite identity that it has. It does not simply get subsumed in the way, for example, in some of the texts composed at the court of the Delhi Sultans, Gujarat is completely subsumed, right? Here, Gujarat is a territory with a history, with a past, with people who are living descendants of the ancestors who shaped Gujarat in the 15th century. So while you have a very strong presence, very strong Mughal presence in Gujarat, the Mughals cannot simply do away with or easily dismiss the 2 centuries of association that many prominent Sufis and their families have established in this region.
Yeah, and thank you so much, ma'am, for answering that question. And you are currently working on a history of Muslim scholarly networks in the 16th century Western Indian Ocean, using a variety of Arabic narratives, texts produced in Gujarat and the Hejaz. So we wish you the best for that work. Hopefully, we'll get to read that as well. The book Narrative Fast is available online, so those who are interested in getting the book can we'll share the link of the book in the description of this video on YouTube. So thank you so much, ma'am, and thank you so much everybody for joining in.
Thank you so much, Ishan. This was truly a pleasure. Thanks for offering your platform to me, and thanks to all of you who joined in. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you all have any question, those who are watching us can mail us at carvanheritage@gmail.com. We'll share those questions with Dr. Gulati and she can get back to you through email. Thank you and have a great evening ahead.